Hey, good afternoon, people. Darcy and Marie, and who knows? There are so many more people getting on board listening to my podcast. It's August the 7th, and it's still smoky outside. Apparently, in the next 5 days, it's supposed to rain here, which would be nice. Now, this podcast, I've had a chance, what better thing do I have to do as a 74-year-old? I was talking with a young lady that I had met who had been involved in a cult with Nathan Chasing Horse. And I'm only saying this because we're going to schedule a podcast and talk about healthy human sexuality in terms of Indigenous females, and how, for me as an elder and a senior, and her as a young woman, she was making a comment that, her grandmother had passed away, and she never had that connection with her grandmother. And I was talking about how, as we age and how we, as human beings, how we respond to being still sexual, because it ain't over until we're 6 feet underground. And the notion of just things that, as women, we've been suppressed or oppressed in terms of discovery of things that are meaningful to us. And the fact that as human beings, we deserve to be seen. So I'm going to go through a couple of essays that I went through with TikTok, and they're enlightening, but at the same time too, you've got to be really careful. Like, a large part of this educating on healthy human sexuality is geared to young Indigenous women. And rightfully so, because as we age, we develop critical thinking skills. And I truly believe that because of the advent of social media and a lot of conspiracy theories that are so outrageous that can be scientifically proved to be conspiracy theories. Whereas there are other things, when I talk about my own personal life, that's how I have lived my life and what has worked for me. And it's not like something that I'm trying to give advice to, but there are certain things that, like in life, that I find a lot of common experiences across the board when it comes to talking about just things that happen in life. And a lot of things, too, in recent years, and again, for me, at the age I have been, again, I'll say, in the 70s, women couldn't own a credit card or even finance their own home. Now, even in the 70s, too, in Iran, like, women were doctors, lawyers, leaders, and now they have to wear burqas. So fascism and the whole understanding of what it is and how it sort of creeps into our very psyche without even knowing it, because we're involved in some sort of active addiction, which I hope will somehow, when I talk about this, will sort of have some sort of, critical thinking. So I'm just going to go on with what I've read. And I'm sorry, I'm not validating the bibliography of who actually said it, but I am going to go through it as much as I can. So this lady says, women did choose men, not men. Women picked the men that they were going to have children with. Now, this is just this woman's theory. For most of human history, before we know, like she's saying, 5,000 years ago, patriarchy started. Women did the choosing, not men. Women picked partners and mates, and were more often picked much younger men because they were selecting things that we don't select for necessarily. So she's saying that they were selecting potential partners, not mostly dominant or the best looking or the richest. Women were generally going through a selection process, and patriarchy sort of flipped it around so that for women, and handed it to men, and men started approaching and pursuing and deciding. So again, she's saying roughly 5,000 years ago, we forget there was other ways. And this is just her theory. And again, too, you can take it up if it's conspiracy theory or if it really resonates with you. So part of what we're seeing right now
with men is, she's saying, is that men see women as being unapproachable, or they're afraid to approach. Men are afraid to approach women, and dating. She said even not even capable of dating right now because of women. So it's actually an evolutionary course of correction. It's almost like, as she puts it, the system is forcing a stop. It's blocking men from doing the picking so that women get the time, maybe in a generation or maybe 2 generations, to get uncomfortable and get comfortable with doing the choosing again. Like, again, I'm saying from my own perspective, when I was sexually active and promiscuous, I did the choosing. And because I chose not to be to have a partner or to have children, a lot of this, having a man choose me, I've never experienced that. Usually when I found men to be very clingy and attaching to me in a limerent form, I just couldn't handle it, and I just put boundaries down. I said, no, I don't want this. It needs to be like a mutual understanding. And I do think this woman, in her theory, resonates with me, because I do think as like the 70s is like, that's 50 years ago, that there has been a change in how women, especially younger women, see things, and even too in terms of bisexuality, like that bisexuality in some theories is normal. So again, too, the whole construct of how we're trained to who has chosen. She says here, stepping into the choosing isn't just a kind of a small dating shift. It's a mental one that is potentially a really big evolutionary one. And it asks something much more of women too, not just picking the man that makes her feel good or pays attention to her, but really truly thinking about it. That's why women once did the real contributions, considering your contribution to evolution and what comes next for the generations behind you, stepping into fullness of responsibility if you want to, if you decide to have children. Like, that's her theory, and that's the reality of it. It's like, when I talk to women and say, well, I had a choice, you made a choice to have children. And a lot of, I think, women that I've known, and I hate to say this, but women who are pretending to be Indigenous bring on this religiosity, like, oh, well, that doesn't resonate with me. My children, my daughters want to have children. They want to be mothers. So, like, for me, in terms of intergenerational trauma and limerence and the attachment and, active addictions and just the realities of what is available for the healing process and in terms of healthy human sexuality is very limited in Indigenous communities. So, when I'm talking to women who are pretending to be Indigenous, who have never lived in Indigenous Inuit or Métis communities, it's very difficult. And again, it's their choice to walk away and ghost me. What can I say? That's just my opinion and my experience. Because again, there are sometimes a lot of people don't understand certain things, and I know some of the times most of what I've been talking about is like recently what's been happening with the recovery center here in Tsuut'ina and the separatist movement, and even like this whole bunch of white supremacists doing some training just away from here, a little on the outskirts of our community in Millerville. It's amazing that people feel like it's a breeding ground for white supremacy in Alberta, and like as if there's welcome doors here, and yet they don't realize, like, the Indigenous population here, they don't see us because we're in the rural areas and not in the urban centers. Mind you, again, Calgary and Edmonton have huge Indigenous populations as well. So again, I've gone through TikTok, and again, I'm reading these things about nuclear families and sexual human beings, like sexual repression that delivers through institutions produce a very specific psychological type,
people who are obedient, people who are fearful, people who are dependent, and they are also susceptible to fascism. So that's why when I talk about intergenerational trauma, especially when it comes to the sexualization or the repression of Indigenous girls from Indian residential school, because those were institutions, specific psychological type that they embodied, like to be obedient and be fearful. Like I explained, my mother was afraid of white people, and and again, who are dependent. They become dependent on what is suspect as what is deemed normal and appropriate under the whole scheme of fascism. Now, I want to sort of talk about how do I put it in a way that see, Indian resident, like when I've done some podcasts about slavery in the 1500s with the conquistadors and how they were trafficking like children, Indigenous girls as 14, 13, impregnating them, the whole machismo or the whole evolution of how our own men turn against our own women in how they take us as property. Why am I talking about this? Well, because a lot of times things start becoming normal because a lot of the history or the corruption or the distortion of the actual person's life that has been trafficked has been erased. And so a lot of things that especially Indigenous women and Black women have gone through has been erased. Now, even in terms of the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson and Washington, and even the breaking away of these two a Republican and Democratic Party. What's the Industrial Revolution as opposed to slavery or freeing the slaves, or using like in terms of the Republicans, and in terms of more of white working class. All this stuff is so historical, and yet it all binds into having people who are going to be slaves or servants. And isn't that what colonization is all about? There's no fixed solution in how to decolonize yourself. We're just embedded into it. And a lot of times when it comes to discussing what pretendianism is based on that social construct of colonialism and the thought of who belongs to who and why. And like when I say I'm born into systemic racism, that's what I was born into. So again, when I talk about industrial schools, those and the Indian Act and the law that was predicated, understand this, like we're talking about slavery. So when slavery was abolished, there was 100 years of slave owners just grooming and breeding, having breeding grounds, because you couldn't import slaves, so you had to breed them within the plantations. And then even freeing the slaves too, that was also, even Jefferson, even though he didn't want to free his slaves, and then you have other people who want to liberate, but you also want to have them industrialized and be part of the big machinery of working in factories for cheap labor. So again, all this colonizing and revolution and the economy boosting, because in terms of the progressives or we'll call it the Republicans, it was always like, we're going to make this great, this big, great country. But it was all based on having people who were slaves to their jobs. So, and again, I'm being really simply, my language is being very simple. Okay, so when I say industrial schools, the government had passed a law called the Indian Act, and they were grooming young boys, especially in the Treaty 7 area, and they were taking mostly young boys who were mixed blood. So somewhere in their genealogy, they were either French, Scottish, some European bloodline, but they were recruiting and having them come into these industrial schools to be trained as ranchers and farmers. And under the guise of like, okay, this is cheap labor. Okay, we're going to have Indigenous boys who are going to be like basically they're slaves. Now you can argue and say that I'm just full of crap, That's okay. You're entitled to that. This is just my personal opinion. But the reality of it, even in Parliament, they said, well, if we educate these young men and they go back to the reserves, they're going to be converted back to savages. So, like, savages cannot be slaves. Understand this, too, when they started the slave trade and they were recruiting and taking large amounts of Indigenous girls into Europe, a lot of them were dying because we weren't used to the diseases. And even when they tried to enslave us in the Americas, a lot of the Indigenous people sort of were absorbed into other tribes. So there was a huge, like, understand this. The first 100 years of all, like, the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French colonizing, like, there were some, like, again, you can say about the conquistadors, they were horrible in terms of torture, but also the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were instrumental in the slave trade. Like, and you could hear horrific conspiracy theories of what they did to children. Now, again, I'm saying conspiracy. But understand this, too, when I talk about industrial schools and Indian residential schools. The law, even today, the Indian Act is set up so that we're basically wards of the state. Now, in that sense, too, you can say, okay, well, that's a form of fascism. Yes, because we have to basically do so much paperwork just to get a law or amendments so that our trust money can come back to our people. And even then, like there's so much being publicized right now that people would have access to this. Whereas before, we couldn't even hire a lawyer, couldn't even have a bank in our communities. We had to have a ticket just to leave our communities. And like I said, even women couldn't, like, this bill is being passed to grandfather, grandmother, all these ancestors from decades since the Indian Act was first created. Now, again, why have so much control over Indigenous people? Why? Because they wanted cheap labor, slavery. You know, my mother and my aunties and my grandparents, the women were always maids. You know, just like the black people in the United States. No, we were never considered to be like in businessmen, academics. This was all part of the structure of the Indian Act. So anyway, in this one essay, this is just my personal opinion. So she's saying his argument was that fascism doesn't require evil people. It just requires its repressed people and the institutions that are doing the repression. The church, patriarchal family structure, compulsive heterosexuality are the same institutions that make fascism possible. They are the mechanisms. He also says that you cannot swap out economic or political systems and expect things to fundamentally change if you leave the sexual repression intact. So that's why, as an Indigenous elder woman, I'm trying to do podcasts on healthy human sexuality, because it has so much to do with that repression or that fear or that shame or guilt about even talking about your sexual desires. So anyway, this goes on. So it says, so if we move forward, if we move towards socialism, which I think is generally a good direction, but when we don't dismantle the repressive nature of the church and the nuclear family and heterosexuality, we must produce a different flavor of fascism. Now, here's where I think he misses the critical point from what this woman is saying. He was working entirely on the heterosexual lens, and because of this, he did identify sexual repression as the key mechanism for making a society susceptible to fascism. But he couldn't imagine what freedom actually looked like, because she is saying, I would argue that to truly free sexuality has to begin with accepting that bisexuality is the human baseline. It's not a deviation. Okay, so you got to sort of think about this and understand this. If you've been so indoctrinated about heterosexuality and you haven't sort of looked at what makes you sexually happy in healthy exploration, fantasy, even understanding your own human development from early childhood, like, you have to have the courage to do some self-reflection. Okay, the essay goes on that it's not a phase that someone goes through. is it's not just the phase, it's not just a preference. I think that it is a baseline, and I think that we need to accept that. And if we can do that, then a lot of other things start to make sense. For example, rape culture, as she's putting it. The prevalence of rape fantasy, specifically among men, doesn't come from nowhere. It is a direct product of sexual repression. It represents the authentic pornographic connection. Intimacy, desire is not made accessible to want. So, like what she's trying to say is that you don't allow men to repress their bisexuality. You get rape culture. And again, I know even when I was talking to an elderly woman who was in an old folks home, and I was talking about human sexuality and what where the G spot is, and she just said, I don't know. My whole life I don't know about sex. So when we talk about sexual repression, that's what I'm talking about, is that there's the inability to talk about bisexuality or intimacy. So again, this she's saying there's bisexuality, you get rape culture. So again, I want to reiterate where the female G-spot is and where the male G-spot is. And that's a biological function where the male G-spot is. And if you don't know where it is, Google it. So the fantasy of rape is what happens when you take a human being's sexual life and put it in a box for too long. That what you've got is okay, I know I'm paraphrasing. So the major conservative political events, Grindr crashing during those events. See, I didn't understand what Grindr was. Like, again, like I said, a lot of what's happening in social media and what's available to our young people, like Grindr culture, like even the Republicans, when they have these conservative parties in huge cities, the Grindr website crashes because of bisexual activity, men hooking up with other men. The worst kept secret in American life is that the loudest voices of compulsive heterosexuality are often being toted by men who are privately terrified of their own most repressed becoming the most dangerous. I had a white acquaintance who said to me, the most dangerous person a woman could be associated with is their partner. But even with a white woman, the most dangerous person, yes, is their white partner. But it's also when he's not even engaged with her, when he's with other white men and they give themselves permission to do horrific things. And again, this is where this whole conspiracy theory comes in with Jeffrey Epstein and all these things that you really have to do research and have some critical thinking skills behind it. But again, too, a lot of this is theory. So what she's saying is she's trying to point forward to a deep interconnectedness of all this fascism, sexual repression, rape culture, the church, the nuclear family, are all not separate problems. They are all the same problem. And they are the heart of what we call Western civilization and the very core of what means to be, quote unquote, civilized as a system of sexual repression. So the most people don't even know it's there. They just know that what we know is desire, that when we have desire or we feel desire, it's dangerous. And until we dismantle that, until we actually accept bisexuality as a human baseline and stop organizing society around the repression of that truth, we will keep producing conditions that are ripe for fascism over and over because their oppression is still doing its work. William Reich, R-E-I-C-H, argued that sexual repression, the kind that gets enforced through religion, through nuclear family, through the idea that there is only one right way to human beings, that kind of sexual repression, that room where you slowly I don't know. Like, what I'm trying to say is that sometimes as women, we just focus our whole society around men. We don't, like in terms of literature or in terms of films and things that, are dominant with men in there. Whereas when you're I'm just saying this like in terms of the audience, if you're lesbian, then you're going to be wanting more lesbian content in terms of literature. And I think, too, it's the same thing with men in terms of bisexuality, instead of having to repress it in grindr culture, and as well as rape culture. So this woman who's talking about this says, so women who are in partnership, long-term partnership, we know that now that coercion often doesn't look like force. It can be disguised as feeling like you're sexually liberated or open-minded or adventurous, or just you're just not an uptight woman. So you say yes. And she's saying yes to pornography, okay? So in this relationship, what we're talking about is men and women in partnership, where the man is engaging in porn with his female partner. So so what he watches and what he tries and what he suggests to have done in the sexual relationship, she goes along that way. He convinces, and the woman is convinces yourself that this is gross and that you're expanding your sexuality. So it's an engaging and saying, well, no, this isn't gross. We're just expanding our sexual experimentation, and because maybe you're not expanding towards your own desire at all, maybe you aren't even, maybe this isn't even in your fantasy, driving that exploration in your own life. And in many stories I've heard so many other women, the exploration usually lives in like there's only one direction. You don't necessarily discover that you love these things. You discover that he wanted them and they were readily available and they were everywhere and you were present as a kind of normal exploration. So saying no felt like you would make you seem repressed or insecure or judgmental. See, and I'm talking like again, in my community, everybody knows each other, and so when there's young couples who newly get married before they even start to have children, so used to have parties. They'd all gather together as young couples and watch pornography. And this one particular couple, I think they had about 5 children. Again, the woman is taking part because the man, is saying, well, I don't. You're not a repressed. You're not insecure. You're not judgmental to this woman who I grew up with. I grew up with these two people. Okay. Now, why am I saying this? Is because both of them were pedophiles. Yes, they were in a relationship, and each involved in this porn. And again, people who participated in these gatherings watching porn as couples didn't actively have orgies. I'm just saying that this was probably in the 30 years ago, maybe 40. So again, I have never been in a relationship, but I do know these people, and I do know some of the people that they hurt. Some of these people were just 15 and 16 years old, and the result of it is like the one woman, she's passed away now, and the fellow, he's been charged with sexual assaults. It comes out in people say, oh, natural law, and I think when you're in a community where there's holistic and a collective, it does come out, whether or not you want it to come out. And I think that's why it's so much more dangerous in white society, because you're so individualistic and you don't have community, and so you don't get to see the outcome of this we'll call it this what do you call it, lack of critical thinking skills, or these swinger parties, or this grindr culture. Anyway, I'm just saying human behavior. So this lady is saying you don't necessarily discover that you love these things. So this and she's talking to women, Okay, because women have been taking part in this, in the relationship. And sometimes, so you just keep going on for years in your relationship, and then one day you realize that you're just not excited anymore. You don't want to do this, and you're not turned on, and you're simply performing. By putting it back, it doesn't feel like you're discovering your own desire. So again, the repression of women's sexuality in terms of the relationship with their partner. Now, I had a niece, and I've met a lot of, young, brilliant people who want to go into therapies and psychology, even older people who are pensioners that want to go into therapies. And I'm going, why would you want to do that? The majority of people that you're going to be talking to are going to be talking about their sexual behavior and how to, like, the conflict that partners have. I just, like, that in itself is a whole big different conflict resolution that I just go, nope, gives me the heebie-jeebies. I don't want parts of that. So anyway, this lady is saying it feels like you're threatening the relationship, and it feels like you are judging him, and it feels like you are changing the rules. After years of saying yes, you don't say it anymore, and you keep performing. So she says, in a long-term trap that many women find themselves in, it feels like it's sexual freedom or exploration, but sometimes it's just what it really has been, exploitation, or posed as exploitation is really just an exploration of his desires and not your own. That's why when I say I'm going to do a podcast on healthy human sexuality, especially when it comes to female healthy human sexuality, and that there's no shame or guilt or something where you need to repent for participating in it for so long that it's because it was mutually acceptable from the outside, when really any particular sexual act is inherently wrong or evil or perceived that way in order to control your sexual libido or desire. Like it's about, like, the different questions you ask yourself: whose desire is really leading the relationship? And that's a hard question, not only for, like, just you who are listening, but for everybody. It's impossible for us to answer. But you have to remember, the last thing that you're introducing something that is sexual, that you generally want to be felt completely comfortable to do and to pay attention to. And if you feel like you just simply can't say no, that's something to pay attention to as well. Your enthusiasm has slowly faded until it's almost gone, knowing you're not alone, and it is a common experience for many women. And sometimes the first step isn't becoming more adventurous. Sometimes it's just becoming honest enough to ask yourself what you actually want and knowing what this isn't for you. The problem is sneaky patriarchy doing its job. And again, she's talking about why when a male partner introduces pornography into the relationship. So again, a lot of times when people talk about things that well, we'll talk about racism. Because sometimes, like I say, identity, and again, even with pretendianism and the word identity, like I've said, like, it's an evolution of changing our thought, behavior, and patterns of, what we feel is healthy. I know recently, like I said, there was a group of white supremacists doing some training in Millerville, just south of here. And this one lady on TikTok, she's talking about the practice of racism is bereaved. I don't know what the word bereaved is. There's something distorted about the psyche. The huge waste and its disruption and distortion. It's like its profound rise that nobody examines. It feels crazy, it's crazy, and it leaves. It has just as much deterioration delirious effect. Delirious? Okay, I'm sorry, but I'm just reading the essay here. And I should do some bibliographies, but I'm sorry. So anyway, this white person on white people, but we take it away, take your race away, and there you are, all strung out, and all you've got is this little self. And what is it? What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong, still smart? You still like yourself? She's saying, those are the questions. It's a part of it is, yes, the victim. How terrible it feels for black control like that. I am not a victim. This is a woman, she's a black woman, and she's saying, I'm not a victim. I refuse to be the victim of the other person who is normally inferior. And that's a serious question. Of course, racist, if you have a whole, like his or her self-esteem, and the definition, like you can only be tall, or because, like, if you're someone kneeling in front of somebody who is tall, there's a serious problem, because, like you're saying, she's saying, my feeling is white people have a very, very serious, like, that they have to start thinking about, like, if you take black people out of the question, she says, do you understand that people who do this, who practice racism, are bereaved? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste, and it's a corruption and distortion, and it's like a profound neurosis. So, in other words, she says, you take away those hate towards someone, black, brown, whatever. Who are you left with? What kind of shell of a human being are you? That your whole ego, your whole profound motivation and mission in life, when you take that away, then what's left? Like, that's a really profound statement on racism. And I think, too, when I look at, when I hear about people being trained to shoot and kill people of color, I don't know, like, one time I was driving through Wyoming and I got stuck. My poor secondhand car. Every once in a while I'd stop and I'd take a wrench and I'd hit the gas line and the little pebble will dislodge, and I'd pump on my gear guzzling standard vehicle, and usually it would dislodge and I'd start. And one time, this is on my way from Wyoming to Utah by myself. Okay, so I get stuck, and this van, this station wagon pulls up, and two white men, and there's a woman, and they have fishing lines and two children, and the two men come out, and the one guy, like, I could see the woman and children looking at me, and the two men come, and one guy says to me, "Are you black? Are you Indian?" And I thought, what a question. Instead of, hello, do you need help? The first thing he was asking me if I was black or Indian, and I said, I'm Indian. He says, good, because if you're black, it wouldn't help you. So, like, again, this whole, like, if you didn't have that, who would you be? Well, bless his heart, bless his racist heart, that, they hit my thing and the pebble dislodged and my car started, and they followed me to the next town. And as I pulled out of the town, they followed me and they waved goodbye, like that, waving goodbye, like we did a godly service for you. And for me, the reality of, like, what would have happened if I was black? And I've seen that, like, in New York when I've gotten on a bus and there's a bunch of black people and white people getting on, and there's a white lady in front of me who has an extra seat. And every black person, every black woman who asked her if she could sit there, she'd say, no, I've got a friend coming. At the end, when everybody's on the bus, she's sitting there by herself, no black friend. And for me, people are people. Again, too, I say that, and yet, I'm. It's just the way things are. Sometimes it's really difficult to have a white friend. So, a lot of times, a lot of non-Indigenous people don't even realize, like the United States and Canada are two different countries. And in the United States, it was like 35 years ago, Native women in tribal land, the nation couldn't even touch any man who would like hurt an Indigenous woman. It wasn't until 2013 that, as Native women fought the law through Congress, it gave their nations the right to prosecute. So you don't wait to be, like, you're waiting to have somebody protect you, but yet the power, like they had to write the law that, they never taught you that Native women that they've changed the federal law to defend, like, again, this was in, the law was defending non-Native men who harmed Native women on tribal land. Her own nation could not touch him. In the courts, and like the ruling in 1978 stripped that power away, and the predators learned the reservations was a place with no consequences. And that changed in 2013. So a lot of times, even when I talk about Nathan Chasing Horse, and how he was prolific in what do you call it? Wolf's Flats, like Wolf's Points. Wolf Point in Montana, the reservation there, because it's a very poor reservation, and there's a documentary on that, in just how they're trying to recruit police, but they don't even have places for them to live in. So you got to understand this whole dichotomy of policing in reserves in Canada as well in the United States. So in a lot of times when you're trying to have justice for people who do horrific crimes to women and children, they get away with it because they're protected. The law can't touch them. Again, people understand this. Like I said, the Indian Act is a law that's ruled under Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit communities. And only 2-3 years ago, like I said, the 9 Sioux tribes, the Inuit and Métis, were considered Indigenous. Because a lot of people, like, they just kind of hum and haw and go, well, it's not me. I'm not Native American, so it doesn't affect me. But yet they sure as hell, have this colonial stereotype or this colonial way of thinking about, being the white savior. So anyway, there are a lot of other things I could talk about in terms of even how, like, Métis, like in the States it's Cherokee. In Canada, the issue is Métis. So they're two different names, but they're for the same two, like they're talking about Indigenous people. So again, if you want to learn more about that, it's important to know. Again, too, there's a whole structure and understanding of that. And anybody who tries to prove that they're Indigenous in Canada go through quite a rigorous ordeal of learning about the aspects of the Indian Act, and just the fact that we're actually getting lawyers now. It's interesting that people just like, oh, it's the favor of the month, I can pretend I'm Indigenous. So let's see now. Yeah, it's an interesting thing about, like I said, there are some things. So again, I'm trying to be, like I said, I'm scrolling through these things that I'd been thinking about in terms of topics. So here's another essay where they're actually doing research that shows about sexual fantasy, not what we've been told. So this guy, Dr. Stacy, a private intimacy advisor and sex coach, is helping you see that it's just not about genitals. So let me give you a clinical picture on fantasy. Research actually consistently shows that having active sexual fantasy life is associated with a higher sexual satisfaction, not lower, higher relationship satisfaction, and not a sign of dissatisfaction with your partner. It also shows that fantasy and desire to act are neurologically different. Okay, understand this. Fantasy and the desire to act are neurologically different. Having the thought is not the same as actually wanting it to happen. Your brain can find something compelling without your body or your values agreeing. And here's something else that almost nobody talks about. Women on average report fantasy lives that are just as active as men. The shame around female fantasy is entirely culturally constructed and has no biological basis. So this is what I do, and this is the talking in the essay. It takes decades of clinical research to make usable for real people to get results. Because your fantasy life is not the problem, it's informational. So again, when I talk about limerence and I talk about survival, and that, before there was civilization or the construct of academics and clinical psychologists and social workers, and people throughout history went through trauma, like the whole construct of like shame and guilt, and like how, again, in terms of oppression and repression, that it has to be clinically, like you have to have real people at real time help you navigate through the deconstruction of that event. And that event could have different fallacies or different illusions or delusions depending on the trauma that you experienced at what age. And this is like a whole lifetime of like decades and decades of self-reflection. And a lot of times too, you don't even know that you're being triggered, because if you haven't visited it before, then again, like I use the analogy of driving down a rickety road and there's a lot of potholes. And for each trigger, you hit the pothole and damage your your tire, or your what do they call it, your wheel alignment. Okay, so the more you hit the potholes, the more you damage your vehicle, and that's what I talk about recovery and relapse. So the more that you're involved in your active addiction, the more you damn well hit those potholes, and the more you damage your vehicle. Okay, so by the time you're in your 50s and you've been doing this without any help or guidance or like support, active support, and trusting another human being in learning to guide away from those potholes. That's why it's important to understand, when you're a child and you're looking and as an adult and you're looking, you feel hopeless, you have to understand, you've got to forgive yourself. You are an individual. You cannot help that high-risk child on your own. You need a community to help you. And it is important that the community, say, for example, is really highly structured with therapists and professional people. And that's like a magic wand, abracadabra. Indigenous people, Inuit and Métis, have sovereignty over their children, and we have all this magical, professional people helping, guiding our children. That, like I said, it's a magic wand. It's just going into legislation in Canada for us to have sovereignty now. So, like I'm trying to say to people, understand this. We are not the same as people who are living in the province who've been, sort of like the whites, like the slaves or the serfs of the industrial mechanism called industrial revolution. And like the whole notion of how, the class system interplays. Like when I talk about the Indian Act, I talk about the caste system. When I talk about systemic racism, I talk about the caste system, because it's based on that. It's based on a caste system of who gets up to the upper class. Anyway, as well as like where we're talking about women on average report fantasy lives that are just as active as men. So again, like the shame around female fantasy is entirely culturally constructed, and it has no biological basis. So that's why, like when I'm saying I'm going to have a podcast with Indigenous women, I'm talking about culturally constructed, how we were perceived as being sexual females through our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers, and how it's been handed down to us. And it's important to have that discussion. So, like, again, a lot of things that I talk about, have been done and established with real people over clinical research. And the sad thing about it is, like, a lot of the documentation about Indigenous people has been really distorted by the Canadian Psychology Association, because they refuse to even document Indigenous women who, like Indigenous academics who, have done the work. They refuse to publish them. So again, why? Again, it all has to do with this class system. And that's just my personal opinion. Okay, so I sometimes when I do talk to women about the G-spot and the clitoris, and I talk about orgasms and just the whole nature of the biology of women, and the fact that there's the argument, and two, sometimes I know I trigger women, and sometimes when I do talk about healthy human sexuality, especially when we're having a debate on like when people are having sex and there's liquid and fluid that come out, and they say, well, that's not pee, and if I trigger you, like, I'm sorry, but it is urine. Like, it is made by the kidneys, and it's extraction from the bladder through the urethra. It does not mean that the guy jokingly says, this isn't a water sport. It's for one reason we have the clarity on this subject, because it would help to remove some of the shame that people who can and do experience this gush of fluids in their orgasm, because we can guarantee that your partner who is there to experience the beauty of the waterfall does not care what it is. It's a place of trust. And again, this is what I'm talking about in terms of women having the ability to free themselves. Unless they're repressed and the man is having control and is using that to repress or oppress or basically put shame and guilt on you even experiencing that desire or that awakening that a lot of women don't feel. And again, it's only if they say no and they start realizing, no, I've got to experience this in my life. And that's why, like, it's important for young women to evolve into understanding this in terms of sexuality. There are so many senior women who don't even know where the clitoris is, who don't even know where the G-spot is. And so, the whole case is like this fellow is saying, looking again to find out that the bladder in all cases was the source of this fluid because it was empty. Like when they were doing the research and saying, okay, where did it come from? And then we have this second one, which is a wild study. If you read the details, because of what they did, they had this woman, they catheterized them, drained their bladder, injected them with blue dye into it, and when they brought it, the completion again. And guess what? In any case, the emitted fluid was blue and really quick. So he says, we need to address the fact that people think that squirting and female orgasms are the same thing when they are not, or the female ejaculation are not. There is physiologically two separate events. Squirting consists of clear, pale yellow fluid, and that is because it is produced in the kidneys, and the other very rapid rate in order to fill up the bladder. But if you looked at it chemically, which they do and they have done, they find the components of urine in it. So he says, but it tends to be creamy and white, sometimes sticky fluids that produce a smaller amount, and it's produced in the pituitary or skin gland. These are located on either sides of the urethra or just inside. And you take a look, you may actually be able to see the tiny pinholes. That is where the fluid is emitted from. But wait, there is more, because this plans are also known as the female prostate. That is because when you take the fluid, you look at, this is what it is. It is found in the PSA, or the prostate-specific antigen. And this is the same thing you will find in the male semen that is being produced and pushed through the prostate. This means that when you are getting your giblets properly jiggled, I like the way he says that, properly jiggled, giblets, you're emitting both fluids together. It does not mean that squirt is something mysteriously third fluid that we don't fully understand, and there is no reason to be ashamed of it or anything else. Let your partner come to the water fountain and tell him to drink up. It's funny that people actually think that this is true, but square does not pee. Okay, it has, again, PSA and some other things in there, and you might think that it's just pee for whatever reason, but get the narrative out of your head, because it's not just pee. It does, but it does pre-cum, but so does pre-cum. Is pee, it is urine, it is made by the bladder, it is excreted from the bladder through the urethra. It does not mean that if you're into water, like again, I'm just repeating what he said, and it's important to, talk about these things. So again, do men have a high sex need drive for masturbation? I know I'm going into this, like I said, I found these articles very interesting. And again, too, there's critical thinking. Like I said, this isn't something where you just sort of go in, I want to learn something. Unless you've actually had a healthy sex drive and have been seen as a sexual human being and can talk about these things, then it's not going to overwhelm you. And so, like if you have a compulsive need to have an orgasm, if your sex drive is linked to testosterone and libido, then that means your body is functioning properly. If you're compulsively cannot control yourself, it sounds more like an addiction. A man that is fully in his body will never need to use his wife or the body of another woman to simply get off if you have the desire to make love. That will lead you to do the emotional and physical work to pursue your wife and not just use her as an object. So again, the whole understanding that women, like again, if you're in the relationship and you've been saying yes, and you realize, I shouldn't be saying yes because I don't feel comfortable, then because you feel like your partner has been using you as an object. Sometimes it takes a lot. Like I said, it's even when it comes to lateral violence, and for me as a child wondering why does my mother stay with my father, or why do my aunts or these female relatives in my community stay with these men when they're so violent towards them. So again, too, I think a lot of has to do with shame and guilt, that they're not being, fawning, this limerence, all this mental health stuff. And again, I'm not just talking just about Indigenous women. I think it's a historical fact in terms of fantasy and limerence and being a survivor. And so how do you create safety and stability in your relationship so that your sexual intimacy is calm and regular and satisfying in both of you? If you don't ejaculate today, you won't die. Then this guy is saying this to the guys. He says, let your desire be fully functioning men and not lead you to, pornography in private or masturbation in private, but to cultivate this emotional and physical intimacy flourish in your relationship. Being compulsive is not a high sexual drive. Choose to be emotionally regulated and harness all the sexual energy to benefit your relationship and create safety. If you're a couple that is rebuilding trust right now, I'm only talking from female understanding. When I see older females who are battle fatigued, and their central nervous system is so out of whack because they haven't been able to regulate. They've just been constantly being bombarded with relapse and recovery, not just from their own central nervous system, but from their adult children and even their grandchildren. So it's compounded, and no wonder they choose not to be in any sexual relationship, because then they'd have to deal with that individual too, which again is going to be triple whammy on the female psyche. And again, all the more reason to understand your mental health and to find balance and understanding of what it is to be a healthy human sexual in understanding balance of like gambling, pornography, and fast foods, all those that trigger your hormones within your brain, all that stuff that I think in closing, I just want to sort of get to the baseline of I think when it comes to what happens when children are when there's trauma and what happens to the brain, it's really again, there's so many things that I was looking at that would take hours just to understand, but let's see. So it's about regulation and finding a reliable, controllable source of stimulation that relieves when the internal world just feels too overwhelming and too empty to tolerate. In object relations terms, like the like it's like a controllable because it's never disappointed, because it's available and never leaves. Substitute. And like all substitutes for genuine connection, it works in short term and creates profound isolation in the long term, because it's not addressing what addressing was never really for sexual contact. It was for content, for aliveness or something real. As always, this resonates. So again, when we're talking about just how the human brain works. A woman loves me and a man never raped me. Okay, and this, again, is a young man talking about how he had to learn about sex all over when he got sober, because he was scared, and it was because the very foundation of his sex was that of being molested, and he can't change that. So he goes back in time and he builds the reality. So the idea of intimacy and love and relationships, what it means to be all jacked up. That's why for him he chases women so much, because he's trying to erase, what had happened to him. So he says having sex with a woman meant that what happened to him never really happened. So he would cheat on his partners, and he didn't have sex. He just, it's the whole notion of somehow he needed to be fixed. He'd run away from the issues. He'd need to find some attention. Maybe it didn't happen as a kid, and love to meet with, he used sex, okay, to normalize the trauma that he experienced. And the sexual conversation is really hard, and sometimes it's greatly emphasized in getting into his sobriety, because it's a huge issue that, just sometimes makes the individual feel all alone and struggles with a woman to love, and that he's understanding that a man didn't really rape him. So again, all this notion and stuff that happens to children, and even how it affects their intimacy with women once they become sexually active. He talks about all this, that he feels broken and he feels damaged, but all that trauma and all that toxicity that you go through, you're stronger, and that you can heal through that. And it all starts by not isolating, and it starts with sharing, and it starts with finding support. That's why I'm saying, even when you're trying to deal with limerence and this trauma, you have to have a support system in place. And they're making excuses that people don't care. You have the ability, you have to have the courage to find those safe places, to find those people that you can trust. If you self-isolate, you push yourself away, and it's just, you cut off everybody around you, and you relapse. And so if you're constantly trying to be an active addiction, you're constantly reacting over and over again. So let's see now. Again, here, I'm sorry to keep on jumping from different things, but see, women are fantastically sexual. They love sex. They think about sex all the time. They want to have sex with guys that have genuine burning desire for. And if you're a woman and your experience of a woman is to the contrary, that I hate to tell you this, it doesn't bring me pleasure to have to tell you. If you're not that guy, you are with a woman, you're married, you don't care how long you've been married, you don't care how much she says she loves you, if she does not have genuine burning desire for you. And this is a guy talking to people, okay? Like I said, when you go into social media, you have to have critical thinking skills here. In other words, she's saying she's ready to jump your bones all the time, virtually speaking, and then you're not, like he's telling these guys, he says, a lot of times women aren't even aware that they don't have genuine burning desire for the guy because they don't have a lot of relationship experience or sexual experience. That's why, like, when I meet older women, they say, well, I never had, like, the sexual experience. So, like, in other words, they really never really had this burning desire. Like, and that's so sad because, we only have one life. So they don't really know what the contrast to that women who've had that and they're with one guy and then they got married or in relationship with another guy, they will tell you that they'll know. And if you're a guy who has experienced genuine burning desire out of women, those guys know too. So not to feel bad. He's saying to this, he's going to tell you, life can be rewarding when you're getting genuine burning desire because, let's face it, sex is a big part of life. So if you want to fix that in your life without being the dancing monkey trying to win approval from your woman or any other woman, but actually coming from a place of strength, which women find extremely attractive. So in other words, I was talking with Josh today about promiscuity, and he says, oh, you broke hearts. And I'm saying, no, there was a desire, but it wasn't like a sexual desire, like a burning sexual desire. It was just, like a need. Like I thought, okay. And I think most like about men, and that most women will not accept, like, women are fantastically sexual. Like, again, a woman has to really look at who the psychological makeup from, self-reflection, like in the age of consent. Like, that's why it's so important to understand your own trauma and your own lived experience, and to have, like, guided imagery with other women, other professionals, so you can get some genuine understanding of the chemistry and the physiology of you yourself. So for example, for me, I'm the oldest granddaughter. My father and my uncles, they didn't have children. I was the oldest, so they didn't know how to behave around a girl. So I didn't realize this, but talking to yesterday, I was talking about this, and I said, yeah, the men that I'm attracted to are like Sasquatches. And, like, if you don't know what a Sasquatch is, look it up. And I said, yes. I said, we're sitting in a restaurant, and I say, yes, if a Sasquatch walked into our restaurant as we're eating, all the people would run. They'd be so scared. I said, for me, I'd just sit there and go, do you want to have a seat? I said, because that's how I was raised. Not like, and again, it's not any fault of the caregivers in my life. The caregivers in my life never abused me sexually. It's just how they behaved in terms of the testosterone and all, like being scary. It wasn't, to me, they weren't scary. It was just like I was just sexually attracted to them, not even knowing that that's what was happening. But as I became sexually active and I gravitated to Sasquatch men, and I'll use an example, like I met this deserter from the Vietnam War. Again, scary, okay? And throughout my life, that burning desire, I've never felt that, ever, after. Okay, because I've just never met a Sasquatch after that. So, and I'm using that as an analogy, and I'm making humor of it. But the reality of it is, as all women have this we'll call it a psychological construct that was established like in structure, like from age 5, and as it builds up in your childhood until you become sexually an adult, to understand what your body feels like, you have to understand it. And for me, like say being seen, giving myself permission to have boundaries when I'm sexually attracted to such men who have this charisma of a Sasquatch. I mean, people can laugh and say, "What?" No, but the reality of it is like it's just in my nature. And I explained it to the lady I was talking to yesterday. I said, my older brother, we had this rooster that would just charge and attack all the kids. And I'm a child too, but this rooster was running after my older brother, and I just went running right up against that rooster, yelling at it to leave my brother alone. Not afraid of it. And that's just part of who I am. And I cannot erase it. I'm not going to have religiosity say that thou shalt not behave this way. I shall not be oppressed. This is just who I am as an Indigenous elder female. And I think, too, when I tried to do the podcast on healthy human sexuality, when it comes to grandmothers talking about their sex lives with their grandchildren, and even having them understand that libido, that sexual drive, doesn't go away. It's a part of us until we're 6 feet underground. And I use the analogy of like my friend whose mother, she looked after her mother for 17 years, and she was 97, and so when she says, I've been after my mother to do some walking. She says, and the reality of it is she won't listen to me. She won't walk. She refuses to. And she says, but then again, too, she says her physiotherapist came. She says, now look at her. And I'm on a Zoom call with her. And sure enough, I can see, her mother walking back and forth. And so she says, yeah, the only reason she's doing that is because her physiotherapist is a handsome man. And so, and it was really interesting. I said, I'm so fortunate that I knew your mom, and that you took care of her. You didn't put her in a nursing home, and you saw her as a sexual human being right until the day she passed away. So that's the reality of as we aged. So anyway, there are some things too. Let's see here. I know there's one about again, too, you have to be really critical in what you see and what happens in social media. And I think a lot of young people get bombarded by the things that we think are important, but really they have no comprehension of just how dangerous it can be to think that some of these people who claim to be knowledge holders and are they're conspiracy theories, and they have some mental health issues. I think recently too on TikTok, one of these big influencers started lashing and cutting himself. I know one young woman whose partner had died a couple of years ago, and she's increased her visibility and viewers by 80,000 people. So again, it's sort of like a voyeur when you're in social media and doing TikTok. So anyway, I think I want to conclude with some of the things that I think how we regulate our central nervous system, and how, we tell our central nervous system what's unsafe. So usually you get a bear hug, wet blanket, or the body saying you want to be held. These neurodivergent location describes love as something to the nervous system due altogether. the Creator calls them locators rather than language. He breaks down the heteronormative history of the origin. These alternative love languages, there are like what love actually is when the nervous system needs to tell its truth. And so she talks about this article that comments on these 5 things that that they name and that are completely missed. But see, she said, when you go into the 5 ADH love languages, they found that these are it's first is like info dumping, sharing everything you know about something you love as an act of trust. I'm letting you into this part of me that lights me up the most. Parallel play, being in the same place, same space, the same room. Now I want to go into this act of trust, sharing everything you know with something you love as an act of trust. I went through that. I went through that with Wachashtawaste. And okay, so parallel play, being in the same space, the same room, doing the same thing. No performance required, just your presence. So again, just having that is a love language in itself. But also, I don't know, there's another, something that one, like you see it and you thought of it and and I was thinking of you. So in other words, like gifting, if I see something and I purchase it because I'm thinking of someone, I'll gift it to them. And that's part of love language too. When you're not there, but your executive function, like you might be, like you switch it up, you regulate, like you regulate each other, like it's consistent contact. It tells your nervous system like something's unsafe. It's a bear hug or a weighted blanket. Like it usually with anxiety too, a lot of people use a weighted blanket to calm their central nervous system down. And so it's like she said, it's heteronormative history of the original like love language. So when the central nervous tells you the truth, you're familiar with the, like it's like a ritual or ceremony, and you go through it with individuals throughout your life, and it's sort of like a checkbox. Okay, I've done this with this person, and it's it's a validation, because it's validating that you've put some boundaries down and you're respecting each other, that you're both accepting each other. And so I wish I had this one about the central nervous system, and maybe if I can find it in here and I can put it through, then
what I heard,
no, that's not it. I did try to go through all of this. No, that's not it either. Sorry. Here it is, hopefully.
Yeah, it's a light day here on the channel. When you experience trauma, especially as a kid, it really does a number on several systems in the brain. Starting with, like, the amygdala, the body's threat detector. It can become more sensitive. The bit of brain noodle at the front of your skull, the prefrontal cortex, the spot that is responsible for emotional regulation, becomes less effective. And then you have the stress response, which is full of hormones that rewire the brain to prioritize whatever fixes stress the fastest. When the electrical cucumber, your brain is emotionally numb or anxious or feeling depressed, there are shortcuts like sex that will allow it to take a break and organize for a bit. And your brain doesn't tend to care about what works long term. It wants easy fixes, what works right now. And sex can be the ultimate form of self-medication, because it is a literal cocktail, or cocktail, depending on which way you're going, of things like dopamine, serotonin, endogenous opioids, and endocannabinoids. And then you have a little bit of oxytocin, a bonding hormone, thrown in on top. So not only does it do a fantastic job of organizing everything and providing a break from emotional dysregulation, it is also self-reinforcing, which makes it pretty powerful. And it's no accident that things like food, alcohol, and gambling also fall into this category of coping strategies, because they activate, albeit not as strongly, the same reward pathways and hormones. And evolutionarily speaking, or survival-wise, this is not bad programming. A brain that is raised in an environment that is filled with trauma, that is unpredictable, is going to become hypervigilant, and it is going to seek immediate rewards or things that provide relief and connection. And sex offers reward, relief, and connection. Tab A is in slot B. You're connected. Please remember that stuff like this does not mean you are broken. It means that you are a survivor. The good news here is that if these are behaviors that you want to change, the brain can be rewired. It is malleable, and you can learn new, healthier patterns of coping. And while DIY is an option, it is beneficial to hire a professional when you are dealing with a complex machine like yourself. They are going to provide scaffolding and shortcuts and accountability that you simply may not be able to do on your own. But you're not broken. You're a survivor. Remember that. We're going to be talking about hypersexuality and...
See, that's why I'm talking about when I say hypersexuality. And again, it's accountability. So that's why I say shop around for mental health workers, shop around for people who support, that can lay those boundaries down. And as you interact with other people and they're doing this for you, or you're helping yourself to get to this point, then those central nervous system and balancing and coping. Like I said, as you're driving, you're avoiding those potholes. But again, too, you've got to understand you're a survivor. You're surviving that road where there's a lot of potholes. So eventually, as you're driving and you see those potholes, you can miss them. And once in a while, you can hit a pothole, but the recovery is going to be a lot faster. And that's why I say healing is possible, especially when your brain has been traumatized from a very young age. And I use that, like when I say I'm attracted to Sasquatches. Yeah, that's like that was the impetus or the catalyst for self-exploration and reflection. And I've had decades of doing that. Like I said, I've spent most of my life not being sexually active, and most of the time when I have talked about human sexuality it's with women who've chosen to have children, who have had these traumatic events, and who haven't had the ability or the capacity to find professional help to guide them in accountability when they're trying to deconstruct and reconstruct new pathways, neurological pathways that eliminate addiction responses. Okay, so again, I like I said, I'm not a therapist, a social worker, or a psychologist. I'm an Indigenous elder who hopes to talk to a lot of young Indigenous women and young and again middle-aged women and even older women who have a difficult time understanding their sexual needs and even looking after their physical health, because it all associates with how we feel about ourselves, and any self-destructive notions or idolations, fantasies or delusions. We ourselves can be our worst enemies, so we need to do some self-love as well as be accountable for those things that we are prone to relapse in. So I hope that helps you. I know it's been a fragmented podcast, and I apologize, and I'll probably go through my notes and get a better introduction, body, and conclusion for this. It'll eventually come out as a podcast with some other Indigenous women from that are Native American in the United States, and because it's all has to do with colonization and how Indigenous women have been silenced and shamed and marketed and trafficked and erased. Have a good day. Like I said, it's Friday, and I'm really I'm enjoying the day. I really appreciate the fact that I'm not being ghosted by everybody. And like one of the key points too that I had wanted to make. Sorry, again. there were so many things that I wanted to say, but sorry. It's just sometimes the smoke really is, like my voice changes every once in a while. But we were talking too, I know there's some issues of rape culture and ritual abuse that I hadn't even talked about. And again too, I think sometimes I'm not trying to make like things overwhelmed for you. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I thought I had some really good things here. Okay, here. The book is called White Spaces, Missing Faces. This book is called White Spaces, Missing Faces by Why Women of Color Don't Trust White Women by Candace M. Jackson. Trust relationships is everything. This is what I want to conclude it on, okay? Because like I said, I feel good because, not all white people are bad, but the relationships with white women, relationships is everything women of color don't owe you trust. You earn it every day and every moment. White women tend to get comfortable once they establish a relationship with women of color. I know that. Like just recently, I've had a white friend ghost me. It's highly possible to earn a woman of color's trust one day and lose it the next. It only takes one microaggression to lose the trust of a woman of color. Tell me about it. I had told her ever since I was a friend with her of how easy it is for me to just not even care. Because I've gone through it. I've been grifted before. Racism is a part of who you are. You have been indoctrinated into white supremacy in every part of your life. And I keep on saying that. I kept on saying that. And she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry on behalf of all white people." And I said, "Do you know how I see you?" I said, "You're standing there and all behind you, there's a billion white people. Like how can you say these and justify this?" So anyway, she says, "I believe this is also applies even if you're not ethnically white, but you're white like me." Like this lady is saying, even if you're not ethnically white, but you're white, you'll always see the world through white eyes and the lens of privilege. Therefore, it will always be easier for you to get too comfortable and messed up. Don't be comfortable. So this lady is saying, the white spaces, missing faces, and why women of color don't trust white women. Even in academia, when I've sat there with PhDs and I said, I just recently trusted a white woman. Now again, that trust has been broken. And here's all these academics looking at me, and I'm going, no, as an elder, this is a constant thing. It's like deprogramming or deprogramming from being involved in a cult. She's just like, oh my goodness, and the reality of it is like, even when I made a comment about my mother, like I said, when she first was pregnant, she thought she was going to have a litter of puppies. And this white woman from academics in the crowd starts laughing. I took offense and I didn't address her. I just said to the audience, I said, the reason my mother felt that way is because when she was in Indian residential school, those white people who were looking after her treated her like an animal, treated everything that she did as an animal. Even when my great-grandmother came to visit my mom, my mom says they put her in the basement and they had her sleep on a bed of straw like a cow or horse or a pig. The reality is that my mother was raised as an invisible child. Nothing about human sexuality was ever taught to her, and the fact that a white academic doesn't know what systemic racism is, or that why in Indian residential school these children were treated like invisible, Because what? When they get into society, all they're going to be are slaves. They're going to be invisible, just like, like the hired help, like a black slave. And the fact that there are some Indigenous people who were the house nigger. And I use that N-word really deliberately in the sense like, yes, we did, Indigenous people we do have our own. But that's from the reality of the fear of like the fawning of yes, master. And so, undoing all this, we're part of it. We're part of all of this. And for me, and like I said to Wachashwastea, who is a white man, when he's talking, I said, you don't understand. You don't understand, like, for me, I'm saying why it's so hard for me to trust white women. So if it's hard for me to trust white women, how hard is it for me to trust white men? The other day, I went to a food court. I was all by myself, and I found an isolated place where I could eat. Lo and behold, an old white man came and sat behind me. For like a half hour I was eating, and he was there staring. He thought I was alone, and then finally the two people that I had come with found me and sat beside me. As soon as he realized I was with other people, he got up and he left. And I've said this throughout my life. I've had white men stalking me that way. Even in the state of Utah, when I would walk to work, I had a man stalk me with his car for a whole year. I used to have roommate. I used to be, rent, and people would break into our apartment, and they just target me because I was an Indigenous woman, a woman of color, in a very racist state. So yes, it's really difficult to trust white women, and I'm not like I said, it's it's a racism is a part of who they are. They've been indoctrinated into white supremacy every day of their life. So again, the relationship, women of color don't owe you. I don't own her trust. I do not owe anybody trust that's white. A person has to earn it every day. A person has to put those boundaries with me every day. And it doesn't matter if you're male or female. You need to do that. And for me, I really appreciate Wachashwastea for constantly putting those boundaries down with me. So anyway, that's my conclusion and my lesson in love and life. Life is worth living and life is worth loving. And for all those who are feeling depressed and just feel like overwhelmed with what's happening, there are invisible helping hands out there. There are. As hard as it may seem, and as hard as life may seem, it's worth living. Okay, so with that, thank you for listening, and Wopida Midaki Api Owasana. Creator Grant.